In the heart of a sun-drenched African village, where the red soil met the golden fields and the air was alive with the chatter of merchants, drums, and the laughter of children, wealth and ambition danced quietly in every shadow. The village was prosperous, known across the region for its thriving trade in cowries, beads, and exotic goods. Wooden carts rattled along earthen paths, carrying sacks of rice, millet, and carefully counted cowries. Traders boasted of their fortunes, and every household tried to outshine the other, displaying silks, carved ornaments, and gleaming utensils. Yet beneath this shimmer of prosperity, there were whispers, soft, barely audible murmurs of envy, greed, and the fragile boundaries of trust. The richest among them, often the proudest, were those most vulnerable to folly. Amidst this wealth lived a young girl, no more than 15 summers, whose existence seemed to barely matter to her own family. Her hair, coiled tightly and brushed with care, framed a face both delicate and sharp, with eyes that held curiosity and a quiet resilience. She had inherited none of the father's boastful pride or the mother's fleeting warmth. Her parents, or rather the one who was supposed to care for her, saw her as a burden, a weight that tainted the sparkle of their wealth. Though she worked tirelessly around the household, fetching water, cleaning, and helping with chores, her small victories, the completion of tasks, the moments she smiled despite weariness, were unseen, unappreciated. Her laughter rarely echoed in the halls. The room seemed colder because of the absence of kindness. And yet, in her eyes burned a light that no neglect could extinguish, a quiet intelligence, a deep understanding that life was more than what the selfish and greedy could see. Her father, once a man of principles, had grown increasingly consumed by the lure of wealth. Cowries jingled in his mind long after the day's transactions were done. Their smooth, polished surfaces promised status, influence, and a legacy beyond his humble beginnings. And in the shadows of his desire, he saw an opportunity, one that twisted the bonds of family into something unrecognizable. The daughter he should have protected became instead a commodity, a measure of his ambition, a price to be paid in silver and cowries. He weighed her like the goods at the marketplace, calculating the worth of flesh against fortune, his heart shadowed by the murmur of greed. Yet the village did not entirely turn blind. Beneath the laughter of merchants and the clamor of trades, unseen eyes observed. Spirits of the land, the ancestors, and the forgotten voices of the past watched silently as human folly played out beneath the sun. They noted every whispered lie, every greedy glance, every act of betrayal hidden behind a smile. Their judgment was patient, slow, and inexorable like the creeping tide. And while the girl herself sensed nothing of this, her fate was quietly entwined with powers unseen, forces that noticed injustice long before the village dared to acknowledge it. In this world, ripe with color, commerce, and life, one girl's existence seemed inconsequential to those around her. Yet even as her father's greed whispered promises of wealth, and even as the village remained oblivious to the cost of ambition, something beyond human reckoning began to stir. Betrayal, sorrow, and unseen eyes converged, setting the stage for a tale that would not only mark her life but also etch a warning into the very heart of the village. A story where cowries could speak, and even the smallest price of human life could carry the weight of eternal remembrance. The morning sun spilled its golden light across the village, casting long shadows of palm trees and mud brick houses on the red earth. Birds chirped high above, and the market began to stir, the distant clatter of pots and the soft jingle of cowries marking the rhythm of life. But inside one modest home at the heart of the village, a storm of a very different kind was unfolding. A storm not of wind or rain, but of human greed and moral decay. The young girl, the one who had done nothing but live and breathe, sit and serve, now faced the unimaginable. The possibility of being sold like a mere object, her body weighed against polished cowries in the hands of a father blinded by desire. Her father, once a man of fair repute, had grown increasingly obsessed with the cowries that jingled in his chest and in his dreams. He had heard whispers of a wealthy trader from the neighboring town who sought a young girl for purposes veiled in secrecy, but with a promise of considerable payment. And so he pondered, what was a daughter's love compared to the glint of wealth? He called the trader to his home, a tense negotiation taking place under the scrutiny of his own conscience, which he tried desperately to silence. Every coin, every silver shell that clicked against the other in the trader's palm, seemed to echo in the girl's chest like the hammering of drums, announcing her fate before she could even plead. The father's voice was calm, measured, but beneath the surface ran a current of greed, justifying the unjust. He spoke of the girl as though she were a prized possession, not flesh and blood. She is strong, intelligent, and capable, he said, smoothing over the fact that he would now betray her entirely. A fine addition to your household. I ask only what is fair for her. The trader responded in kind, testing the limits of negotiation, aware that the father's moral hesitation might be the key to lowering the price. The cowries were counted meticulously, shuffled across the table, and weighed against promises and intentions. Each movement of the shells seemed to echo through the silent room, a heartbeat of greed and indecision. Meanwhile, the girl herself sat at the edge of the room, her hands folded, her chest tight with disbelief. Her mind raced, unable to fully grasp the enormity of what was happening. She stared at her father, searching for a glimmer of recognition, a hint of hesitation, anything that might indicate he still remembered her as more than a commodity. "Father, please," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible against the jingle of cowries. Her words hung in the air, fragile like fragile wings caught in a storm. But her father, absorbed in the mechanics of bargaining, hardly heard her. Each shell exchanged across the table felt like a blow, each coin dropped like a nail sealing her fate. She could not believe that the man who had once held her as an infant, whose arms had soothed her fears, could now treat her as property, counting her worth in cowries. Outside the house, villagers went about their daily business, catching fragments of tension through open doors and murmured conversations. Some sensed unease but dismissed it, assuming that family disagreements and disputes over trade or chores were commonplace. "It is just a quarrel," they whispered among themselves. "Surely the girl is safe in her father's hands." And yet, even as they moved on, a subtle tension lingered in the village air, like the faint tremor before a storm. Few could see the invisible threads of injustice weaving through the household, the moral decay that had turned a father's love into a transaction. Spirits, however, watched silently, their eyes keen, noting each act of betrayal, each rationalization of cruelty, each flicker of the girl's despair. The universe, it seemed, had taken careful note of human folly. The negotiation stretched long into the afternoon. Every offer and counteroffer, every polite nod and measured phrase, was a dance of greed disguised as civility. The father justified himself with half-truths and rationalizations, convincing himself that he was providing her a better life, that Cowries could offer more than he ever could. But deep down he knew the truth. He was betraying his own flesh and blood, trading warmth and love for cold shells that would soon jingle in someone else's pocket. The girl's wide, tear-filled eyes followed every motion, her heart pounding not with anticipation, but with fear and disbelief. She had not asked for riches, for power, or for favor. She had asked only to live, to be seen, to be loved. And now she was invisible, a commodity. Finally the deal was struck. The father received the cowries, polished and bright, their sound ringing in his ears like a hollow victory. The trader nodded, satisfied, and promised to take her that very evening. The girl's knees weakened, her voice caught in her throat, and she felt the world tilt around her. She had been sold, a daughter exchanged for coins, her humanity reduced to value in shells. The spirits whispered around her, the wind shivering through the open windows, and the girl understood even then that the cowries would remember, long after the father counted them as wealth, long after the villagers forgot the injustice. The day wore on and the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the village's dusty roads. The girl, trembling and silent, followed behind the trader and her father, each step heavier than the last. Her small hands clutched the thin shawl that wrapped her shoulders, a flimsy shield against the judgmental gazes of those who had once smiled upon her. She avoided meeting anyone's eyes, yet she could feel the weight of every stare, the curiosity, the gossip, and most painfully, the subtle judgment that blamed her for the very misfortune thrust upon her. Every footstep toward her unknown future was a step away from the life she had known, a world shrinking behind her with each passing breath. The path to the trader's home wound through the village and into the outskirts, past the bustling market where cowries jangled in the hands of merchants and the rich scent of roasted maize filled the air. Villagers paused in their daily routines, glancing at the procession with quiet intrigue. Some whispered in hushed tones, questioning whether the girl's departure was her choice, yet no one dared interfere. Others, distracted by their own lives and the lure of wealth and trade, dismissed the scene entirely. Only the wind seemed to notice, rustling the leaves in uneasy patterns, carrying with it the faintest sense of injustice, a warning that something unnatural had been set into motion. Her father walked ahead, holding his head high, the cowries he had received tucked safely into a satchel across his chest. He did not glance back, did not meet the sorrowful eyes of his daughter, nor did he hear the faint shiver in her whispered pleas. The trader, silent and imposing, moved beside him, eyes sharp as they scanned the surroundings, measuring both the value of his acquisition and the ease of his new possession. The girl, tiny and frail in comparison, felt as if she were being weighed by invisible scales, each step of the journey a reminder that she had been reduced to a transaction, her life quantified in coins and shells. As they passed through fields of maize and open streams, subtle signs of spiritual unrest began to manifest. The leaves quivered unnaturally in the still air, and the water in puddles shimmered as though reflecting not the sky but something hidden, something watching. Small creatures, normally shy and cautious, froze in place as they observed the passing party. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, whispering secrets in a language older than the village itself. The girl sensed the presence but could not name it. She only knew that the world had grown heavier, the air thick with expectation and unseen eyes. It was as if the spirits themselves were accompanying her, recording every indignity, every whispered word of cruelty that had accompanied her sail. She walked silently, head bowed, feeling the humiliation weigh on her like chains. At times, villagers waved politely or called greetings, but their words seemed distant and meaningless, failing to penetrate the fog of fear and grief that surrounded her heart. The girl felt the sting of isolation most sharply when she passed familiar faces who had once smiled and spoken kindly to her. Now their expressions held nothing but neutral curiosity or avoidance. Some had heard the whispers of her sail, but none dared confront her father or the trader. Her misery became invisible, relegated to the space between conversations and the faint murmur of cowries in their pockets. During rest stops along the journey, she sat alone, clutching her knees, staring into the dust that swirled around her feet. She thought of the home she had known, the warmth of her mother's memory, the quiet kindness of neighbors who had once acknowledged her presence, and felt the sharp pain of loss. Each step forward was a betrayal, each mile traveled a widening chasm between the life she had imagined and the one thrust upon her. Yet even in her despair, a faint spark persisted, a subtle whisper within her chest that refused to be extinguished. The spirits that followed her, invisible yet palpably close, seemed to hum in encouragement, a quiet reminder that injustice leaves its mark, but also that patience and endurance can become weapons more powerful than fear. As dusk approached, the group entered a narrow canyon that led toward the trader's distant home. Shadows lengthened, wrapping the path in a dim, eerie glow. The flickering light of the setting sun reflected off stones and water in strange, fragmented patterns. The girl noticed how the shadows seemed to twist and contort unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled eyes, watching her progress, warning the greedy, observing the guilty. Every rustle of leaves sounded like whispers, repeating her father's rationalizations, the trader's polite yet detached commands, and her own silent cries for justice. Though invisible to the human eye, the forces of the unseen world gathered, recording every act of human betrayal, every slight against the innocent. By nightfall, the group had reached the outskirts of the trader's property. Lanterns flickered along the perimeter, casting pale, uncertain light across walls and gates. The girl's heart pounded, a mixture of fear, humiliation, and the faintest glimmer of something more, a recognition that her suffering was not unnoticed. The wind carried faint echoes of ancestral voices, soft and insistent, reminding her that even in captivity her spirit remained intact, her worth unquantifiable, far beyond the cowries that had exchanged hands in her name. The trader's home loomed ahead, unfamiliar and imposing, yet strangely quiet, as though awaiting her arrival with the patience of centuries. And so, with every step toward the unknown, the girl walked with trembling resolve. She had been sold, isolated, and humiliated, but the subtle signs around her, the whispering wind, the flickering shadows, the shimmering waters, reminded her that the world had not forgotten her. Though the cowries had spoken in the light of human greed, the spirits watched in the dark, waiting for the day when justice, subtle but inevitable, would rise. Each step she took carried the weight of her father's betrayal, yet also the promise that her story was far from over. The gates of the trader's compound closed behind her with a heavy clang, the sound resonating like the final seal on a chapter of her life she had never wanted to write. Inside, the walls rose high, painted in pale ochre, yet the brightness could not hide the cold indifference that awaited her. She was led through courtyards and narrow hallways, each step measured and scrutinized, her presence treated not as that of a human being but as a commodity to be managed. The girl's eyes took in every detail, the polished floors, the heavy doors, and the numerous cowries displayed in bowls on ledges and tables. Each shell gleamed under the lantern light, and though they were simple coins to the untrained eye, she felt them hum faintly, almost like whispered warnings in the shadows. The spirits of her ancestors, she sensed, had not abandoned her. They lingered in the subtle resonance of these silvered shells, aware of the injustice that had brought her here. Her new quarters were small and bare, furnished only with a straw mat and a low wooden table. There was no warmth, no comfort, and certainly no kindness. The buyer, a man of stern countenance and deliberate gestures, gave her a list of chores and duties with a voice that was firm, cold, and unyielding. "Sweep, fetch water, polish the cowries, tend the animals," he instructed, as if reciting the responsibilities of a servant rather than acknowledging the stolen humanity before him. Each word pressed upon her like a stone upon her chest, yet she did not flinch. Though her heart quaked with fear, she straightened her spine and nodded, her mind already reaching inward, toward memories and whispered stories of resilience passed down from her ancestors. Days stretched into weeks. Dawn brought with it the sounds of animals and the rustling of servants beginning their routines. The girl moved quietly among the household, performing her duties with diligence, careful to avoid angering the buyer or drawing attention to herself. Despite the harsh labor and relentless scrutiny, she discovered an unexpected strength within her. Memories of her mother, her grandmother, and other women in her lineage rose in her mind like comforting flames. They had survived storms, famine, and cruelty, and their whispered wisdom seemed to flow into her veins. She learned to bend but not break, to endure but not surrender her spirit. Every sweeping motion of her broom, every careful polishing of the cowries, became a rhythm of quiet resilience, a meditation that fortified her inner fire. It was during one of these long, silent afternoons that she began to notice the cowries more closely. Arranged in intricate patterns on shelves and in bowls, they seemed to pulse faintly when she approached. At first she questioned her own eyes, were these merely reflections of light or something more? As the days passed, she realized that each cowrie carried an almost imperceptible hum, a whispering that seemed to respond to her presence. It was as if the shells retained the memory of every transaction, every act of greed, and even every injustice. She could almost hear them murmuring, the voices faint but insistent, revealing the truth of her father's betrayal, the weight of human avarice, and the potential for justice that lay dormant, waiting for her awareness. In those quiet moments the girl allowed herself to dream. She imagined the river running through her village, the trees bending in the wind, and the familiar scent of home. Though she was confined within the walls of her new life, her mind roamed freely, fueled by the ancient stories she had learned in whispers. The cowries, the walls, and even the distant calls of the marketplace became part of a larger rhythm, a universe that acknowledged her pain but also her potential. She understood that her suffering was not the end, it was the beginning of a transformation, a preparation for something far greater than mere survival. At night, when the household slept, she would sit beside the cowries, touching them lightly, feeling the faint vibrations that traveled through her fingertips. In these secret rituals she felt a connection to something vast and ancient, the ancestors who had endured, who had suffered, and who had always watched over their kin. Though her body was confined and her freedom curtailed, her spirit began to expand, weaving through the threads of time and memory. The shells, each a silent witness, seemed to affirm her resolve. The world might treat her as an object of trade, but her destiny was not theirs to decide. And so, life under the buyer's roof, while harsh and unyielding, became the crucible in which her inner strength was forged. Each act of cruelty, each moment of isolation, became fuel for a growing fire within her, a fire that drew power from the whispers of cowries, the silent wisdom of ancestors, and the quiet determination of a young girl who refused to be broken. She was no longer simply a victim, she was a vessel of endurance, a keeper of hidden power, and a force that would one day rise beyond the walls that confined her. Night fell over the trader's compound, cloaking the house in shadows and soft murmurs of the wind. The girl sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, her eyes fixed on the bowls of cowries that glimmered faintly in the lantern light. For weeks she had polished and arranged them, unaware of the subtle magic contained within each small shell. But tonight was different. The air felt charged, heavier, as if the walls themselves held their breath, and the cowries began to vibrate beneath her fingers. At first, it was a faint hum, like the whispered secrets of a distant river. Then the whispers became clearer, forming words, syllables, and voices that seemed to know her story intimately, her father's greed, the betrayal that sold her body for silver shells, and the silent complicity of those who had watched but said nothing. She leaned closer, heart hammering. The cowries spoke not in anger but with the clarity of truth. Each shell told a story of exchange, not just material but moral. Her father's name, once spoken with pride in the marketplace, now echoed within the hushed murmurs of the cowries, revealing the deceit and moral corruption behind the transaction. The girl's fingers trembled as she realized that the very objects that had symbolized her commodification now carried the power to witness, remember, and testify. In their silent, intricate arrangement, they became agents of justice, each shell a recorder of greed, each bowl a testament to human folly. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was laid bare by the murmuring shells that no eye could have seen, no ear could have heard without her attunement to the spiritual world. As she listened, a warmth spread through her chest, mingled with the sharp sting of betrayal. The Cowries spoke of her father's misdeeds but did not command vengeance. They revealed truth. They guided her understanding that injustice was not just a private matter. It was woven into the moral fabric of the village and her own destiny. The murmurs became more insistent, almost rhythmic, like the beating of a hidden drum, synchronizing with her heartbeat. She realized that these small objects, mere shells to the untrained eye, held a connection to forces far older than the greed that had sold her. They were a bridge between the earthly wrongs she endured and the ancestral justice that awaited her. Her mind raced. If the Cowries could remember and whisper, then she was not powerless. The injustice done to her could not vanish into silence. It had been recorded, nurtured by the small murmurs that awaited her recognition. She touched each shell deliberately, tracing patterns as if communicating with them in a silent dialogue. She understood that when the time came, these Cowries would serve as witnesses, guiding her actions, revealing hidden truths, and ensuring that those who had betrayed her could not hide from the consequences. The power of the Cowries was subtle yet undeniable. They gave her knowledge, insight, and a connection to a justice that transcended human law. By the first light of dawn, she withdrew her hands from the bowls, her spirit ignited with purpose. The Cowries had spoken and she had listened. What had once been a symbol of her father's greed had become a source of power, a reminder that even in the shadows of betrayal, truth endures. She felt an inner clarity, a sense that her eventual return, her reclaiming of agency and justice, would be guided by forces far beyond ordinary human reckoning. The murmuring of Cowries in the dark was not only a revelation of the past, it was a promise of the reckoning to come. Each shell, each whisper, became part of a growing tapestry of power, patience, and inevitability. She would rise from the shadow of betrayal, and the Cowries would be her silent witnesses, testifying to the truth that no amount of silver could ever erase. The girl spent her days in quiet observation, moving through the buyer's household like a shadow, unseen yet always aware. Each action she took was deliberate, measured, and calculated. She noticed the routine of the servants, the habits of the buyer, and the lax attention of the guards who patrolled the courtyard. Every detail mattered, where the doors creaked, which windows were left slightly ajar at night, and how the servants whispered secrets among themselves. She mapped the house in her mind as if drawing a living blueprint, each corner a potential path to freedom or opportunity. No one suspected that the quiet, obedient girl, beaten down by circumstance, was quietly planning the reclamation of her dignity. The Cowries she had listened to in the dark had taught her patience, and she now learned to apply that patience to observation, timing, and the subtle manipulation of opportunity. In the evenings, she retreated to small, hidden spaces, a shadowed corner of the courtyard or behind stacks of clay jars, where she could think without interruption. It was in these moments of stillness that her inner power strengthened. She recalled the whispers of the Cowries, the murmurs of the ancestral spirits, and the quiet wisdom her mother had left imprinted on her heart. With each breath, she felt her resolve grow stronger, blending cunning with patience. She learned to sense when danger approached and when the household was distracted. She began to understand that her true advantage was not physical strength, but knowledge and the spiritual insight she carried quietly within. Her mind became a weapon, her patience a shield, and her awareness a guide to eventual liberation. The girl observed more than the household, she observed the village beyond its gates. Complacency ran deep among the townspeople, who were preoccupied with their own trades, gossip, and petty disputes. No one noticed the injustice that had befallen her, and that neglect became her opportunity. She studied patterns of travel, the routes merchants took to and from the marketplace, and the paths less guarded at night. These observations would later allow her to navigate the town with confidence and precision, ensuring that when she finally returned, she would do so with both control and authority. Her understanding of human weakness, combined with the spiritual awareness nurtured by the Cowries, formed the foundation of her strategy. Each day her inner power grew, not through outward confrontation, but through silent resilience and reflection. She practiced small acts of control, shifting objects just so to test patience, speaking softly in tones that hinted at unseen understanding, and moving through spaces with a deliberate grace that drew no attention but demanded respect. She recognized that the combination of cunning, spiritual insight, and patient observation was far more powerful than anger or rebellion alone. Her suffering had taught her to see the invisible threads connecting people, the subtle motivations, hidden fears, and quiet greed, and she planned to use this knowledge when the time came to reclaim her agency. Night after night, she visualized her return, walking through the village, reclaiming her place not with violence alone, but with justice, guided by awareness, patience, and spiritual force. Every step of her escape, every act of strategy, was carefully considered. She understood that freedom was not merely leaving the buyer's household, it was restoring her dignity, exposing the truths that had been hidden, and ensuring that those who had profited from her suffering could not escape accountability. The girl's plan was more than a simple flight. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would blend human cunning, ancestral guidance, and the inevitability of justice. She would rise, and when she did, nothing would remain the same. The night was thick with shadows, and the compound seemed quieter than usual, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The girl crouched in the corner of the courtyard, heart hammering, listening to the faint creaks of the old wooden beams above. Every sound was magnified, the rustle of leaves, the distant barking of a dog, the soft padding of her own careful steps. She had waited for this moment for days, observing the guards' routines, noting their slowness in patrolling the perimeter, and memorizing the patterns of every door and gate. Her escape would require patience, precision, and courage, and she had prepared her mind and spirit for the ordeal. Even the faintest mistake could lead to recapture, but her determination burned brighter than any fear. The cowries she had discovered earlier were close by, arranged in bowls within her small hiding space. Their soft murmurs seemed to grow stronger as she moved, whispering encouragement and guidance in tones only she could hear. Each shell's subtle vibration felt like a gentle nudge, pointing her toward the safest paths and warning of unseen dangers. It was as if the spirits within the cowries were aware of the reckoning to come and now lent her their power to ensure she reached the first step of her journey. Her fingers brushed over the shells one last time, and she felt the whispered promise of justice ripple through her. This night, the seeds of vengeance planted by betrayal would begin to bloom. She moved like a shadow, pressing herself against walls and ducking behind crates. The guards, oblivious to her presence, patrolled lazily, distracted by their mundane duties and the night's stillness. The girl's breathing was slow and controlled, matching the rhythm of the murmuring cowries. The whispers seemed to echo in her mind, blending with her heartbeat, guiding her steps as though the spirits themselves were leading her. She paused at a gate that led to the village outskirts, testing the latch and listening for sounds of pursuit. Everything aligned perfectly, as if fate itself had bent to ensure her escape. As she slipped through the gate, the air of freedom filled her lungs with a sharp, exhilarating sting. The village beyond was quiet under the cover of night, shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. She moved swiftly but cautiously, keeping to alleys and walls, following the safe paths she had observed from a distance. Occasionally, a flicker of light from a lantern or the murmur of a distant voice would make her freeze, heart racing, until the sound faded. Every step was calculated, deliberate, and fueled by the knowledge that her oppressors had no inkling of her awareness or preparation. Along the edges of the path, she noticed subtle signs of her growing power. Puddles glimmered with faint reflections of her face, cowries hidden in nearby huts seemed to vibrate softly, and the wind whispered her name as if carrying the promise of her impending justice. The mystical energy she had nurtured during her captivity flowed through her, blending cunning with spiritual guidance. She began to feel less like a victim and more like a force moving toward its inevitable purpose. Her mind was sharpened, her senses heightened, and her spirit aligned with the ancestral power that had always watched over her. In one narrow alley she encountered a stray dog, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. She paused, uncertain for a moment, then realized it was a guardian of sorts, a subtle ally sent by unseen forces. The dog's presence gave her reassurance, and it slinked alongside her for a few steps before disappearing into the night. Each encounter, each whisper reinforced that she was not alone. She was guided, protected, and destined to reclaim her power. By the time she reached the outskirts of the village, the first hints of dawn were brushing the horizon with a faint glow. Her escape was complete, but the tension of the night remained, mingled with the electric thrill of survival and the quiet anticipation of the reckoning to come. The cowries' murmurs faded to a gentle hum, a reminder that the story was far from over. The girl's journey toward justice had begun, and with every step the spirits and the whispers of the cowries followed, ensuring that betrayal would not go unpunished. The darkness had protected her tonight, but the fire within her was ready to rise. The village was waking slowly to the first light of dawn, birds beginning their timid songs and smoke curling from early fires. Yet amid this ordinary morning, something unusual stirred, a presence unseen yet deeply felt. She had returned, moving silently along the outskirts, her steps measured and deliberate. Gone was the girl who had fled in fear. In her place stood a figure shaped by pain, endurance, and the unyielding whispers of the Cowries that had guided her escape. Every eye in the village that glimpsed her felt a shiver run down the spine, though none could name the source. Even the wind seemed to bend around her, carrying faint murmurs that no one else could understand. As she walked the familiar paths, subtle signs of change became apparent. Piles of cowries, scattered in the marketplace and along doorways, quivered faintly, whispering her father's betrayal. Merchants paused mid-sentence, their hands hovering over wares as a chill touched their hearts. The very stones underfoot seemed to hum with recognition, acknowledging that the girl, now something more, was reclaiming her rightful place. Her eyes, steady and unflinching, scanned each home, each familiar courtyard. Though she moved silently, the villagers felt her power pressing against the fabric of the village life they had taken for granted, a quiet force that would not be ignored. Her path led her to the house where the betrayal had begun. The familiar walls now appeared smaller, weaker, as if they sensed the weight of what was coming. She paused briefly at the threshold, letting her gaze fall on the Cowries her father had accepted in exchange for her freedom. They seemed to whisper his name over and over, a relentless reminder of greed and treachery. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, echoing through the empty corridors, seeping into the minds of all who lived there. She breathed in deeply, drawing on the patience she had nurtured during her time away, and began to walk forward. The villagers who crossed her path instinctively stepped aside, not fully understanding why, yet deeply aware that the ordinary rules no longer applied. Mothers held their children closer, elders muttered prayers and traders paused mid-call. Even the dogs, normally barking and restless, fell silent. It was not fear born of superstition alone, but of recognition. The girl who had vanished, scarred and betrayed, had returned not for pleading or apology, but as a force shaped by injustice and empowered by the unseen. As she moved through the village, the tension thickened. Every familiar doorway, every corner where children had once played, became a stage upon which her presence performed its subtle warning. The Cowries in hidden bowls and along windowsills murmured constantly, broadcasting whispers of the father's betrayal to all who had ears to sense them. No words were spoken, yet the message traveled faster than any voice. The past had returned, and it carried the weight of reckoning. Her movements were deliberate, yet graceful, like the tide creeping over the sand, silent, inevitable and impossible to resist. She paused before the house of her father and the buyer, letting the morning sun glint off the cowries placed around the courtyard. They shimmered as if alive, reflecting not light alone but the truth hidden for so long. She had been treated as a commodity, her dignity bartered for a few coins. The villagers watched from a distance, unable to look away, caught between fascination and dread. Even those who had ignored her plight now sensed that justice had a new form, and it had returned in human guise, carried by her presence and amplified by the whispers of the mystical Cowries. Slowly she stepped into the courtyard, her gaze sweeping over every familiar face. The murmuring Cowries seemed to rise in volume, echoing with increasing clarity the betrayal that had been committed. She felt no haste, no impulsiveness. Her return was calculated, measured, yet imbued with quiet authority. The tension in the air was palpable, hearts raced, breaths quickened, and the villagers realized in a way they could not fully articulate, that their world was about to change. Every movement she made, every silent glance she cast, carried the unspoken promise that those who had wronged her would soon face the consequences of their deeds. By the time she reached the steps of her father's house, the village had fallen into a hushed awe. The murmuring of the Cowries, the gentle rustle of leaves, even the distant crowing of a rooster, all seemed to conspire in her favor. Her return was not loud, not boastful, but the weight of her presence, amplified by the mystical justice she carried, was undeniable. The reckoning had begun, and the village could feel it, a pulse growing steadily stronger with every breath, every whisper, every deliberate step. The village held its breath. Every heartbeat, every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind seemed amplified, echoing through the streets like a drumbeat of impending judgment. She stood at the center of the marketplace, no longer a frightened girl but a figure woven from years of suffering, resilience, and the subtle whispers of the Cowries that had guided her return. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, scanned the faces of those who had wronged her, the father who had sold her for coins, the neighbors who had looked away, the merchants who had whispered lies in the shadows. Each glance was a quiet accusation, carrying the weight of the injustice that had been hidden for far too long. The cowries scattered around her shimmered faintly, murmuring secrets in tones only the guilty could hear. To the father, the voices were unbearable, a chorus repeating his betrayal over and over, echoing through the walls of his conscience. Every coin he had received, every smile he had worn to hide his shame, now transformed into a mirror reflecting his true self. The villagers, too, felt the vibrations. Those who had aided or abetted the betrayal felt their complicity laid bare, as if the very earth itself whispered of their sins. No sound escaped her lips, yet her presence spoke volumes. The cowries, like tiny oracles, revealed hidden truths that no one could deny. The father stumbled backward, eyes wide, heart pounding. He tried to plead, to claim ignorance, but every gesture was mirrored by the cowries that surrounded him. They rattled softly, yet the sound carried a weight heavier than stone, revealing that there had been no ignorance, only choice. Each villager who had turned a blind eye felt their own guilt pressing against their chest, invisible yet unmistakable. Those who had mocked her, laughed at her plight, or whispered cruelly in shadows now trembled as the eyes of the cowries followed their every movement. The punishment was not bloodshed, nor was it vengeance born from anger. Instead, it manifested in ways subtle yet profound. The guilty found their inner fears laid bare, visions of their misdeeds appearing in mirrors, in the ripple of water, in the flames of hearths. Sleep became elusive, dreams were haunted by scenes they wished had remained unseen. For some, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, an uneasy tremor whenever they attempted deception. Their whispers and lies were reflected back to them in every glance, every fleeting shadow, every rustling leaf. The village itself became a conduit of her justice, channeled through the mystical cowries that carried the truth of her suffering. And yet, those who had done no wrong felt nothing but awe. Innocent villagers, who had neither mocked her nor aided in her betrayal, walked past her undisturbed. Their lives remained untouched, though their hearts were filled with reverence. The contrast was stark. One could see the guilty flinch at every sound, their breaths quickened, hands shaking, while the innocent walked freely, observing a woman whose spirit had transcended cruelty. Her presence was justice incarnate, a living reminder that wrongdoing leaves a mark visible to those who watch closely. She moved through the village slowly, deliberately, letting her gaze rest upon each guilty soul long enough for the weight of conscience to press upon them. Her father fell to his knees, clutching at his head as the cowries whispered in his ears, revealing every transaction, every lie, every betrayal that had led to her sale. He could no longer hide behind authority or family name. The merchants who had participated in the sale for silver, who had smiled at his greed, now quivered as their complicity was mirrored in the tiny shells that encircled her. The village marketplace, once a hub of mundane chatter, had transformed into a tribunal of unseen forces, powered by the innocence she had carried and the injustice she had endured. Every step she took seemed to strengthen the effect. Windows rattled lightly, doors creaked in warning. Shadows stretched unnaturally, leaning toward her as though in recognition. It was a judgment that needed no words, no trial, no decree. It was self-evident, immediate, and inescapable. No child, no neighbor uninvolved in wrongdoing, suffered. Only those whose hearts had been hardened by greed, betrayal, and cruelty felt the sting of exposure and moral reckoning. By mid-afternoon, the village had quieted entirely. The guilty huddled together, each cowrie's murmur a reminder of the chain of choices that had brought them to this point. The father's face was ashen. His hands shook as he tried to reach for his coins, only to find them dull, lifeless, and whispering his guilt. He looked up at her, eyes meeting hers for the first time, seeing not vengeance born of malice but the quiet, unstoppable force of justice. She did not speak, she did not strike. The mere alignment of truth, ancestral power, and the cowrie's revelations was enough to make the village understand that deceit has weight, betrayal carries consequences, and wrongdoing cannot hide from eyes that never sleep. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the marketplace, she finally stopped. The air was heavy with a mixture of fear, awe, and relief. The guilty knew they could not undo the past, yet they had survived. Lesson learned, judgment served, and balance restored. The innocent stepped forward, offering gestures of respect and reconciliation. She did not linger unnecessarily. The reckoning had been delivered, precise and powerful, yet without cruelty or unnecessary harm. Her presence faded slowly, leaving the cowries behind to hum softly, a quiet testament to the justice that had passed through their village. In the years that followed, the story of the girl and the Cowries became more than a tale whispered among villagers. It became a living part of the village's identity. Parents recounted her courage to their children beside flickering fires, not merely as a story of fear, but as a lesson in morality, resilience, and the weight of human choices. Each child learned that the world held forces beyond the visible, that every action, whether cruel or kind, resonated far beyond what one could see. The Cowries themselves became symbols of this wisdom. Small, unassuming, yet capable of revealing truth and delivering justice. Every household retained a few of these sacred Cowries, not as trophies or wealth, but as reminders of the girl's story and the principles it embodied. They were placed on altars, near family hearths, or even carried discreetly in pouches, whispered to in quiet moments. The villagers taught their children to listen carefully, to be mindful of their deeds, and to respect the unseen forces that watched over the village. These Cowries did not merely symbolize judgment. They became a bridge between the human and spiritual realms, a daily presence reinforcing ethical behavior. During festivals, the elders would recount the tale aloud. They described the night when her father's greed sold her away, the journey through fear and isolation, the subtle whispers that guided her, and the moment the Cowries revealed the truth and delivered justice. Children listened with wide eyes, understanding not only the cruelty she endured but also the extraordinary wisdom and restraint she displayed. The story emphasized that true power lay not in vengeance alone, but in justice tempered by discernment, the ability to punish the guilty while sparing the innocent. Over time, her story began to influence village customs and social norms. Parents were more cautious in teaching their children to act with fairness and kindness. Leaders, merchants, and families remembered the consequences of selfishness and deception, ensuring their decisions upheld community harmony. The Cowries, silent yet persistent, acted as subtle reminders that greed could never be hidden, that betrayal had a cost, and that every act of cruelty would one day face scrutiny. No one dared underestimate the moral force of the girl and the spirits she had called upon. Artists and storytellers immortalized her image, often depicting the girl surrounded by glowing Cowries, her gaze steady and commanding, embodying both compassion and authority. Songs were composed, dances performed, and children played games that mimicked her journey, never in mockery, but as a ritualized reminder of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of justice. Each generation absorbed these lessons, and though the girl herself was no longer seen, her presence lingered in every whispered warning and every glimmering Cowrie. Even beyond the village, neighboring communities spoke of her and the mystical Cowries, spreading her story across rivers and forests. Traders would share her tale along routes, travelers would recount the moral to distant towns, and the legend grew until it became inseparable from the identity of the region itself. Through this, the Cowries continued to speak, not in words easily heard by the inattentive but in subtle signs. A shiver in the wind, a whisper in the night, a glint that caught the eye of those who might stray into greed. Thus, her story became eternal, woven into the very fabric of culture. It was more than a warning, it was a guide, teaching that courage, patience, and morality endure, while greed and betrayal leave enduring consequences. The Cowries remained vigilant, guardians of justice, their soft murmurings echoing across generations. And in every home, child, and heart that remembered her tale, the girl's spirit lived on, quiet, powerful, and just, ensuring that the lessons of her journey would never fade. The tale of the girl and the Cowries carries a lesson that resonates through every corner of the village and beyond. Betrayal for the sake of wealth is never without consequence. Her father, blinded by greed, believed that silver Cowries could outweigh the value of his own child, but he underestimated the quiet forces of justice and morality that watched every human action. The story serves as a timeless reminder that material gain cannot compensate for cruelty, and that every act of injustice, no matter how small it seems, leaves an imprint, a ripple that will return in ways unforeseen. The Cowries themselves, though simple and small, became enduring symbols of this truth, whispering lessons of accountability to all who were willing to listen. Children are taught that family is not merely a matter of blood but of care, respect, and protection. Betrayal within the family creates wounds that echo far beyond the immediate moment, affecting lives in ways that wealth or power can never repair. In recounting her story, elders emphasize that empathy, understanding, and vigilance are as valuable as any treasure. They remind the young that every decision carries weight and every action, especially one that harms the innocent, is observed, whether by human eyes or the unseen spirits who guide and guard moral balance. The girl's journey exemplifies how patience, resilience, and inner strength can transform suffering into wisdom, and that even the smallest instruments, the Cowries, can bear witness to human choices. The spiritual dimension of the story reinforces the moral lesson. The ancestors' presence, their whispered guidance, and the magical power of the Cowries show that wrongdoing does not escape the notice of higher forces. These subtle yet profound interventions illustrate that the universe itself responds to injustice. In this sense, the story transcends human law. It conveys the concept of cosmic or spiritual balance, teaching that acts of greed and betrayal invite their own reckoning. The girl's quiet yet powerful reclaiming of dignity and justice reflects the idea that morality is ultimately observed and upheld by forces larger than ourselves. Through generations, this tale continues to shape behavior, instilling a sense of responsibility and ethical awareness in both children and adults. As the story is told around fires, in schools, and during village gatherings, listeners are reminded that cruelty has consequences and that even the humblest objects, like the Cowries, can carry the memory and judgment of wrongdoing. This ongoing remembrance fosters a culture of accountability, empathy, and communal care. It teaches that protecting the weak, honoring family bonds, and respecting spiritual guidance are not optional, but essential to sustaining a just and harmonious community. Finally, the tale inspires reflection on the power of resilience. The girl, though sold and betrayed, transforms her suffering into strength and wisdom, showing that adversity need not result in submission. She demonstrates that the wronged can rise, reclaim their dignity, and ensure that justice is served, even when it seems hidden or delayed. This empowers listeners to believe in their own ability to confront injustice and to recognize that every action they take matters in shaping the moral fabric of their community. Thus, the story of the Cowries and the girl lives on, not only as legend but as a practical guide for ethical living. Its lessons remind every child who hears it that betrayal, greed, and cruelty leave traces that cannot be erased, and that even the smallest witness, a Cowrie, a whisper, a memory, may one day speak truth and deliver justice. In this way, the tale endures, shaping hearts, guiding behavior, and ensuring that the echoes of injustice are never forgotten, teaching the vital balance between action, consequence, and moral vigilance.